All right, folks, well, it's just the beginning of June, and presidential elections are only 5 months away. And the number one topic on everyone's minds, the economy. May's job report gave the GOP the ammo it needed to attack President Obama's recovery plan and his bid for re-election. But today, President Obama found a new scapegoat for America's economic woes.
Right now, one concern is Europe, which faces a threat of renewed recession as countries deal with a financial crisis. Obviously, this matters to us because Europe is our largest economic trading partner.
So let the 2012 blame games begin. But with all this finger-pointing going on, millions of families in America still can't pay their bills. So how much is Congress willing to risk to help their candidate win? To answer that and more, I'm joined by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Reagan administration official. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Roberts. What do you think about Obama's speech and him kind of shifting the blame on Europe at this point?
Well, you know, the policy failures predate Obama. And I think more is going on than him just blaming Europe. I think it's a bigger mess. Washington and Wall Street and the U.S. media are trying to keep the focus off the worst condition of the U.S. financial system. And the eroding support for the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency. And they do this by constantly talking about the European Union crisis. But the worst crisis is in the U.S. And Obama is less responsible for the U.S. crisis than are the Republicans who initiated it. You see, the crisis began with the offshoring of jobs in order to boost Wall Street profits and the performance bonuses of corporate CEOs. And the next leg of the American crisis was the financial crisis, and this was caused by deregulation of the U.S. financial system. And the deregulation transformed the U.S. financial system into a gambling casino in which bets are made, but they're not covered except by taxpayers. So all the talk about Europe is covering up more than Obama's failures. It's covering up the far worse financial and economic problems that exist in the United States.
Dr. Roberts, you said that this was facilitated by a Republican policy, but I mean, you can't deny that Democrats have also continued the failed policy. You mentioned the media's complicity in kind of shifting the reality away from American economics and the true woes of what's going on here. Why do you think the media is playing into this?
Well, they're not independent, are they? I mean, during the Clinton administration, the U.S. media was concentrated, and it's now owned by about 5 big firms. It's no longer run by journalists. It's run by corporate advertising executives. The value of the corporations are their federal broadcast licenses, so they don't want to offend Washington or the powers that control the government. So we can't rely on media reports. And no, I'm not making any excuses for Obama. Of course not. I mean, how can you make excuses for a man who sits in the Oval Office and draws up a list of people to be murdered without due process of law? I don't have any excuses for any of them. I'm just saying that as long as the United States can keep the focus on Europe, it can keep the focus off its own far worse financial problems. There are $230 trillion of derivatives, of which 96% are on the books of the 5 largest U.S. banks. This dwarfs any kind of financial crisis in Europe. So the Europe crisis is a useful thing to point a finger at, so no one looks here.
So what do you think the answer is? I mean, it seems like their answer is print more money, bail out countries at the expense of the taxpayers of those countries.
Well, in Europe, it's to force the people to cover the losses of the banks by giving up pensions, employment, social benefits, that sort of thing. And of course, in the United States, there's a tremendous issue of debt in order to keep the banks solvent. And the burden of that debt ultimately falls on taxpayers. So what is the same in both areas, the United States and Europe, is that economic policy is focused on saving the banks, not saving the economies. And it's not clear you can do both.
And let's talk really quickly about May's job report, a very dismal report. Unemployment's now at 8.2%. Not good for Obama at all, and Republicans, of course, are using this as fuel to fodder. And Romney's response to this was kind of just saying, well, you know, we should take a cue from Wisconsin. What do you think about that?
Well, they can't do anything about employment because for the last 20 years, both parties allowed all the middle-class jobs to be moved offshore. The manufacturing jobs are offshore. The professional service jobs, such as software engineering, research, design, the kinds of jobs American college graduates used to take, they're offshore. So if the jobs are offshore, your stimulus programs can't work because there's no employment to stimulate the people back into the employment's in India, it's in China, it's in Korea, it's somewhere else. And they refuse to acknowledge this fact. And as long as they're blind to that fact, they're not going to be able to do anything about employment. You can't employ people when the factories are closed and when the engineers that the big firms that market to America use are Chinese and Indian, or for that matter, Russian. And
he also said in his speech that the private sector is doing just fine. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's not. Of course not. I mean, it's collapsing. Look, you have to have a minimum of 150,000 jobs every month just to stay equal with population growth. Now, when they say the unemployment rate is 8.2, that's only the headline unemployment rate. The actual unemployment rate, if you count discouraged workers, the official government rate for discouraged workers, it's about 15 or 16%.
Dr. Roberts, we're running out of time. It seems like, you know, it is a lot of rhetoric, and thanks for cutting through some of that and for joining us today. That was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Reagan administration official.